Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into, well, a truly fascinating, though I have to say undeniably grim, chapter of history. We're talking about the brutal systems of torture and punishment that existed in feudal Japan. Our focus is specifically on the Edo period, that long stretch from about 1603 to 1868. And our primary source material for this deep dive, it comes from an article titled Brutal Ancient Japanese Torture Methods by the Infographics Show, which, as you can probably guess, is quite a read.
It is. And our mission here, it isn't just to list off the shocking acts themselves. What's really compelling, I think, is how these methods were, well, profoundly woven into the very fabric of Japanese society back then. They were intricately linked to the social structure, the rigorous honor code, the religious beliefs at the time, and even, political strategies. We're really aiming to understand that deeper cultural context to sort of pull out the why behind the what.
Absolutely. That's the key. So let's jump straight in. Maybe starting with a practice that really vividly illustrates that intricate connection between martial culture and justice in feudal Japan. We're talking about sword testing or tameshigiri. Okay, so picture this. Katana swords weren't just tested on like practice dummies or even corpses. No, the practice involved testing these incredibly sharp blades on live condemned prisoners. It's reported that a truly skilled swordsman could, with one precise strike, split a person, basically, from shoulder to waist. And here's where the societal part gets really striking. If a sword, proved itself in this awful test, it would get a cutting signature, like an actual inscription on the blade. And that massively boosted its prestige and, well, its market value, too.
Precisely. And you see, this practice, it goes way beyond just practicality or even just punishment. It fundamentally linked the value of the sword, the status of the warrior, all of it to this public, ritualized act of killing a human being. It really reveals a society where violence wasn't just, like, permitted. It was integrated into commerce, social status, even the art of sword making itself. Human life, in this specific context, it became the ultimate sort of proving ground for a craftsman's work. Chilling, really.
It really is a chilling demonstration of how pervasive that martial culture was. But what about methods where the influence maybe came from outside Japan, especially during times of intense religious conflict? That kind of brings us to reverse hanging, known as tsunehiki and tsurushi.
Yeah, this technique, interestingly, it seems to have drawn some inspiration from European torture methods like the strappado, but, with a distinct Japanese adaptation. Its main targets, Christian missionaries during those really severe anti-Christian persecutions. Victims would be suspended upside down, often by their feet or arms tied behind their backs, frequently over pits of excrement too, which just adds another layer. The real sort of insidious damage came from the blood pooling in the head, leading to brain hemorrhages or, heart failure. And to make it last longer, often to try and encourage a renunciation of Christianity, they would sometimes perform a forehead slitting technique. Just a small cut.
Right, to relieve the pressure.
Exactly, to relieve the cranial pressure, keeping the victim alive and suffering for much longer. That level of calculated, sustained cruelty is just, it's hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. How did techniques like that forehead slitting, how did they specifically serve those ends of religious repression and political control beyond just, making the physical pain last longer? What was the deeper strategy there?
Well, that's a critical point, isn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about the physical torment, though that was obviously horrific. It was a profound psychological siege. By prolonging life, but life in agony, they created this crucial window, a window for the authorities to try and wear down the victim's resolve. It gave them continuous opportunity to renounce their faith. So it transforms it, you see, from a simple execution into a weaponized form of forced conversion. It shows pretty clearly how the state prioritized that ideological purity, maybe even above a swift death, making a very public spectacle of the cost of defiance.
Wow. Okay, from that, let's maybe explore another method. One that, despite having a deceptively gentle name, was agonizingly brutal. Stone pressing, or ishidaki. The source compares it to the European pressing, but notes it was somehow more refined, which is a strange word to use there.
It is, yeah.
So the condemned person would kneel on something called a soroban board, which was basically a board embedded with sharp triangular pieces of wood. Awful.
Sharp points upwards.
Right. Then heavy slabs of stone would be progressively stacked on top of them. And the ironic name, stone hugging, completely belied the slow, crushing agony it inflicted. What's more, the torturers often used this cruel psychological trick. They'd occasionally remove a stone.
Oh, right. Giving that glimmer of hope.
Exactly. Offering this fleeting, false glimpse of hope only to then replace it again. just twisting the knife of pain and despair.
That psychological element is it's so crucial, isn't it? It speaks to this really deep understanding of how to break a person's will, not just their body, and this kind of calculated, prolonged suffering. Much like boiling alive, which we should probably talk about.
Yeah.
It was designed to be this powerful, symbolic act of utter dehumanization, erasure almost.
You're right, boiling alive. Yeah, that was indeed reserved for enemies of the state or nobles who were deemed traitors, a very specific group. The most famous example cited is Ishikawa Goemon, the legendary figure sometimes called the Japanese Robin Hood.
Yeah.
And to just amplify the horror, families could sometimes be executed right alongside the condemned.
Horrific.
The physical torment, as you can imagine, I mean, it's unimaginable. The body slowly cooked, enduring this intense pain before shock, presumably, finally set in.
Precisely. And to cook a noble or an enemy of that stature in public. It wasn't just about the severe pain. It was about destroying their very essence, their lineage, leaving absolutely nothing dignifiable behind. It sent this unmistakable political message that even their family couldn't escape the consequences of that perceived betrayal.
Yeah.
It was about absolute annihilation, both physical and social.
Unimaginable torment. And while all these methods we've discussed aim to break the body and spirit, there was this other form of death, radically different, reserved for a specific class, where the focus was entirely on reclaiming honor. Seppuku, also known, maybe more commonly in the West, as harakiri. Now, this was exclusive to samurai.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just suicide. It was a highly structured, ritualized, and, in their context, deeply honorable death. Its profound purpose was to, well, expiate shame, to prove one's sincerity, or simply to die with dignity rather than face the dishonor of execution or capture.
A very controlled way to die.
Very. There were specific variants, too, like the ichimonji, which was a straight left-to-right cut across the abdomen, and the even more severe jumonji, which added a vertical upward cut after the horizontal one. Eventually, a second man, the kaishikunin, would stand by. His role was to decapitate the samurai at the precise moment, ideally to minimize the suffering.
That final blow.
Exactly. And what's truly remarkable, maybe, is how powerful this ritualized death remained even into modern Japan. You see that in the botched seppuku of the writer Yukio Mishima back in 1970, which very sadly ended in great agony for him.
Yeah, that was a famous tragic case.
It's really hard to reconcile the kind of brutality we've just been discussing with this concept of an honorable self-inflicted death. How could this self-punishment be elevated to the absolute highest form of honor within that samurai class?
It's a profound cultural paradox, isn't it? But seppuku wasn't really about just ending one's life to escape pain, not primarily. It was about reclaiming dignity, reclaiming it in the face of what they saw as insurmountable shame or defeat. It was about upholding one's name, demonstrating unwavering loyalty or integrity. In a society where the manner of death could literally define a life and a legacy, seppuku was the ultimate affirmation of one's code, their values. It allowed the samurai to retain agency, you see, to choose how they met their end, and thereby preserve their honor in a way no execution ever could.
That makes sense within that framework. Okay, speaking of public displays and ideological control, let's turn to crucifixion, or haritsuk, another method that seems to have drawn at least partial inspiration from European Christian practices. Unlike the common depiction, though, victims were typically tied, not nailed, to the cross.
An important distinction.
Yes, and then they were systematically speared to death, a process known as kushiashi. Given that partial inspiration, it's maybe no surprise this method was frequently used against Christians during those intense anti-Christian persecutions we mentioned earlier.
Right, using their own symbols against them in a way.
Exactly. And there was an even more grotesque variant, mizu haritsuge. Here, the crucified would be positioned at low tide, in the water, and left there until they slowly drowned as the tide rose around them.
Eek. That form of execution, with its obvious visual similarity to Christian iconography, it was an incredibly potent propaganda tool during those anti-Christian purges. It was a very public, drawn-out spectacle designed not just to kill, but to utterly degrade and mock the condemned and their beliefs. And the slow drowning of mizu haritsuke, that just adds another layer of suffering and symbolic obliteration. It leaves no trace, no body to mourn or venerate properly. It was about complete annihilation of the person and their ideology.
Complete erasure. Moving on, we really need to acknowledge the grim, yet absolutely essential role played by a specific outcast class in carrying out many of these horrific executions, particularly beheading. Execution by sword was, well, common, as you might expect in that era. But here's the twist. This task, the actual act of beheading, was often outsourced. It was given to the Edda and Hinin, who were considered outcasts lower than the lowest class.
Untouchables, essentially.
Precisely. And this was done specifically to preserve the warrior class's reputation, to avoid tainting their hands with such a quote-unquote demeaning act. These outcasts performed the most gruesome yet utterly critical state functions. They dug ditches for graves, disposed of bodies, even cleaned the severed heads for public display, and guarded corpses from animals or theft.
It's quite a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
These individuals are labeled non-persons or great filth, literally. Yet society couldn't function without them carrying out these vital, if incredibly stigmatized, tasks. What does that tell us about the deep-seated social hierarchies of feudal Japan?
It really exposes the rigidity, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It exposes the rigid and deeply, deeply ingrained Japanese classism of the period. Despite performing these crucial state functions that were absolutely necessary for public health, public order, punishment, the Eta and Hinin were just relegated to the lowest possible rung. Dehumanized. It wasn't just about their work, it was about their perceived essence. They were deemed unclean or non-human, and that status was hereditary, passed down through generations. It reveals this whole ideological scaffolding of society where maintaining the perceived purity of the upper classes meant pushing all the dirty but essential work onto a permanently stigmatized group.
A stark example of social hierarchy in action. Okay, finally, we encounter methods seemingly designed for just sheer, prolonged agony and public spectacle. One truly horrifying example, burning at the stake or hayabori. This was apparently quite rare, primarily because of the immense fire risk in cities mostly built of wood and paper.
Made sense, yeah.
So it was mostly reserved for arsonists, fitting the crime to the punishment, I suppose. Death typically came from smoke inhalation, unless the fire was intentionally kept slow, specifically to maximize suffering. Our source gives a particularly tragic example, a greengrocer's daughter who was burned after lighting a fire, apparently hoping it would somehow lead her to reunite with a lost lover. Just awful.
Tragic indeed.
Then there's the method described in the source as the most horrifying, sawing in half, or nokugiri. Victims were buried up to the neck and then slowly sawn with wooden saws, specifically chosen because they'd inflict more suffering than metal ones.
That's unimaginable.
And similarly, ripping by horses. Reminiscent of European quartering, where limbs were tied to different horses and then the horses were driven apart.
Again, pure spectacle and agony.
What do these particularly grotesque methods tell us about the absolute limits of power and punishment, and how do they maybe further highlight the role of that outcast class we just discussed?
Well, these weren't just punishments anymore. They were performances of ultimate degradation and control. They really pushed the boundaries of human endurance, designed to serve as the most extreme public deterrence possible, often for crimes seen as just utterly destructive to the social order. And notably, the fact that the outcast class performed the ripping by horses.
Yeah.
It just underscores again how society segmented things, not just who was punished, but who was deemed clean enough to mete out justice and who was condemned to handle its most vile, its most gruesome manifestations. It's really the ultimate expression of social distancing, you could say, within the punitive system itself.
A terrifying thought. Thankfully, as we know, these barbaric practices did not last forever. So let's look at the law, culture, and reform that eventually brought them to an end. As we've seen throughout this deep dive, torture and these extreme punishments were heavily tied to the social hierarchy, the cultural emphasis on shame, and the need for religious and political repression. But a major turning point arrived in 1868. That's the year of the Meiji Restoration.
A huge shift in Japanese history.
Exactly, and it unequivocally outlawed these barbaric methods. This was formalized through legal reform, specifically the revised Penal Code, or Keite Ritsure, and that banned burning, crucifixion, sawing, and many of the others we've talked about. Today, Japan's capital punishment is limited to hanging, and for context, only 98 executions have actually occurred since the year 2000.
Yeah, it's a relatively low number compared to historical periods or even some other modern nations. And this historical shift, it's a really profound marker, isn't it, of how societies evolve their understanding of justice, of punishment. It's a journey from a system where extreme cruelty was ritualized, deeply embedded in social control, to one that, over time, seeks more, well, humane, albeit still severe in the case of capital punishment forms of retribution.
Yeah.
It also makes you wonder, though, what echoes of these historical practices, or maybe the underlying cultural values, might still subtly influence modern approaches to justice, to societal order, even today.
It really does. This whole deep dive, it really makes you ponder, doesn't it? What we've explored today shows how these brutal methods weren't just like random acts of violence popping up here and there. They were profoundly integrated into the very fabric of feudal Japan. They were ritualized, they were justified within that context, and deeply embedded in the everyday governance and ideology of the time.
Precisely. And the why behind these practices, that's the crucial thing to grasp. Concepts of honor, the strict social class system, religious control, these things, fundamentally shaped how these punishments were conceived and how they were enacted. And importantly, how those changing values eventually led to their abolishment as society evolved and redefined its core principles.
Absolutely. And studying this period, even though it's dark, it offers a truly fascinating insight into how societies define justice, punishment, and honor, and how dramatically those definitions can shift and evolve over time. It can really inform our understanding of historical evolution and societal change in general. So, as you, the listener, reflect on all of this, what insights or maybe questions stand out to you personally? How do societies today grapple with these enduring questions of punishment, justice, and upholding human dignity? And how might our own contemporary discussions, perhaps without us even realizing it, still be shaped by these unseen historical forces that echo from the past? Something to think about.